I think every time that I screw up on a recipe, I'm just gonna remind everybody that this is in fact a test kitchen, because oh boy, was this a dumpster fire. I think to call this recipe Gruyere would be an insult to the French culture. Not that they wouldn't be offended anyway, but still, this is anything but Gruyere. Otherwise, I think it's a pretty decent recipe. I think there's some pointers that can be gleaned from it. So the first thing we're going to start is we're going to sterilize our equipment because we don't want to get any nasty bacteria in there. Last thing we want is botulism. We're going to start with about 4 gallons of milk. This is whole cow's milk, and this milk actually happens to be raw, which means that I have the opportunity of omitting calcium chloride, which would normally be used for pasteurized milk. This recipe actually happens to be a double batch from Artisan Cheesemaking at Home, a very good book for any new cheesemakers. Now you're going to notice that this process involves a lot of waiting, a lot of heating up to certain temperatures over the course of certain amounts of time. At this moment, we're actually going to heat the milk up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit over the course of 20 minutes. This process is actually meant to prep the environment so that when you do add your starter culture, first of all, it'll be hot enough that it can activate, but it won't be too hot that it'll actually end up killing the culture in the process. Now this recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of Thermophilic starter culture. However, since this is raw milk, I only had to use 40% of the original amount since there's already active cultures within the raw milk. Then we're going to let that rehydrate for about 5 minutes, and then once we're done, we're going to end up stirring it in for about a minute to get everything incorporated. Now this is a trick that I saw other cheesemakers do. It's where they leave their spoon or their stir in to help settle the milk, and I guess it kind of works. I didn't really see a huge difference. Regardless, we're going to let this sit for about 30 minutes. That way the culture can take effect. This milk is unhomogenized, so therefore the cream will separate towards the top. We don't want that. We want that all in our cheese. We want all that delicious butterfat to be in our final product. What's great about milk is that it has thermal properties that keep it from cooling down for a really, really long time. Now normally we would add our calcium chloride in this step, but since we are using raw milk, we're just going to add our 1 teaspoon of liquid rennet that's been diluted in half a cup of non-chlorinated water. Now we don't want to stir this for any more than 1 minute because the rennet is going to start doing its thing and coagulating the milk. So we want to keep it as steady for as long as we can and let this go for 30 minutes or 40 if you need to. But since this is raw milk, man, we got a really nice clean break at 30. This is probably the best break I've ever gotten from any of my cheese projects prior. So much so that it was actually kind of difficult to cut through the curd. Now we're going to do our very best to cut these curds up into 1/4-inch pieces. After we're done doing that, we're going to let these curds settle for about 5 minutes, which allows them to acidify or heal, which just means that it makes it easier for them to not be broken up during the stirring process. Now you'll notice that I mentioned during the stirring process, and right here is where I made my first mistake. Normally, you're supposed to raise the temperature to 122 degrees Fahrenheit over the course of 1 hour, but you're also supposed to stir the curds so that they release their whey. Unfortunately, I did not stir them, so what ended up happening is that the curds clumped up together in this giant mass that was practically impossible to stir, so much so that I had to cut it up with a knife. And I ended up getting something more akin to mozzarella than something what the book described the size of peanuts, which makes this next portion null, because you're supposed to ladle off enough whey to expose the tops of the curds. That way you can gently ladle in the curds into your mold. But since everything was a giant mass clumped up together, all I had to do was fish out the giant pieces and put it in the mold that way. So if you're wondering, the proper way to do it is to stir for 1 hour until you reach 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Stir for an additional 15 minutes at 122 degrees, let it settle for 20 minutes, ladle off the whey until the curds are exposed, and then gently ladle those curds into your mold. That is in fact the proper way to do this. Now, I could get upset at the book for not specifying this detail, but I had made enough cheese already to know that this was something that every cheese has, where you have to stir to release at least some portion of the whey. Regardless, we're going to keep forward with this recipe. We're going to press this into our cheese-lined tome mold. That way we can move on to the next portion of this cheese. Next, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to press down with 8 pounds of pressure over the course of 1 hour. Is that a wheel? Barrel handle? Look, man, you can judge me all you want, but cheese presses cost upwards of $200, so yeah, I'll make my own. Thank you very much. Once your cheese has finished pressing for 1 hour, you're actually going to want to remove it from the press, remove it from the mold and the cheesecloth, flip it, redress it, and then press for an additional 12 hours with 10 pounds of pressure. Now, an issue I ran into was that it was actually sticking to the cheesecloth, which was very unfortunate. I think if I were to do this again, I would probably use butter muslin instead, and I would spray it down with vinegar. That way it wouldn't adhere so much to the cheesecloth. So I ended up just, trying to redress it as best as I could and then flipping it. Now, we're not going to press it out here, so naturally we're going to move to a different location. Ready? Oh, here we go. Editing trick. 1, 2, 3. Judge me all you want. I'm keeping that in. Now that it's the next morning, we're going to check on our cheese to see how it did, and it did release some whey. Not a whole lot, but we did get some whey removal through that pressing process. Now, to my credit, I took my time with this. I was as gentle and methodical as I possibly could. Even then, I wasn't able to remove all of it. I was able to remove maybe 90% of the cheesecloth, but still, some of it was so embedded that it was just impossible to remove it without tearing the whole cheese apart. Something that you can see right there. So I just left it as is, and we're going to move on to the next portion. Now, this cheese was squishy, which wasn't great, but it still didn't take away from its brine, which is what's called a near saturated brine, which is 1 gallon of water to 28 ounces. That's right, 1 pound, 12 ounces of salt mixed together so that this cheese can be salted rather. Now, here's where I made another fatal mistake. Halfway through the brine, I realized that lid was actually putting so much pressure on the cheese that it ended up making an indentation, which was terrible, but really there was nothing I could do at that point. Now, our second to last step for this cheese is actually to let it air dry over a couple of days, or 1 day in my case, because I live in a very dry climate, until it is touch dry, or rather there's no moisture when you feel the outside of the cheese. Once this cheese was touch dry, I moved it into my cheese cave at 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, where the humidity was at 85 to 90%. Yeah, I know, bro. It's upsetting, but it is what it is. Where we're going to let it age for at least 2 months, flipping it daily for 1 week, and then brushing off any unwanted mold for the remainder of its ripening. Now, let's talk about that whey. You didn't throw it away now, did you? Because that would be very unfortunate. Now, whey has a number of secondary uses, but for this application, we're actually going to make what's called whey ricotta, which is really nice because it gives us kind of like a bonus cheese, if you will. Something that we didn't really expect to get, but something we're going to enjoy anyway. So we're actually going to heat this whey up to just below boiling, so somewhere between 185 and 190. Now, Now once you reach your desired temperature, you're going to add another coagulant. In this case, it's going to be white vinegar. Now I'm guesstimating about 3 gallons of whey, so we're going to use 3/4 of a cup of vinegar, that being a 1/4 cup for every gallon of whey. And this reaction should happen almost immediately. If it doesn't, you can let it sit for a little bit, but in my case, the reaction was almost instantaneous. And you'll see right away that the milk fats will start to separate, and this is really what you want. At this point, you're either going to strain it through butter muslin or a coffee filter, or in my case, paper towels. And once you're done, you're going to get a really pretty product that looks like that. Now this looked more like cream cheese than ricotta, but nonetheless we're going to enjoy it anyway. And after tasting it, I can unequivocally tell you that it tasted more like cream cheese than it did ricotta. Now since this is raw milk, you're probably asking yourself, is it safe to eat? And I mean...